Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. The debate over Pope Francis's major document on the family, Amoris Laetitia, was reopened this week. The raging question that consumed 2 international gatherings of bishops and the Pope's summary letter was, could divorced and remarried Catholics receive communion without an annulment? The final text, though vague, seemed to open the possibility. Now, in a new letter to bishops in Buenos Aires, the Pope suggests that communion for the divorced and remarried might be possible in exceptional cases. How much weight does this papal communication hold, and what does it mean? To put it all in perspective, we are happy to be joined by the Papal Posse. Robert Royal, editor-in-chief of the CatholicThing.org and author of A Deeper Vision, joins me here in Washington. Robert, thanks for being here.
Always, Raymond.
And from New York, our canon lawyer extraordinaire in the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray, joins us from Manhattan. Thank you, Father, for being there. I want to go right to the full screen so you all in the audience can be on the same page. This is what the bishops of Buenos Aires wrote as their internal teaching of Amoris Laetitia, of this document. Here's what they wrote. When the concrete circumstances of a couple make it feasible, especially when both are Christians with a journey of faith, it is possible to propose that they make the effort of living in continence, as brother and sister. In other more complex circumstances, and when it is not possible to obtain a declaration of nullity, the aforementioned option may not, in fact, be feasible. Nonetheless, it is equally possible to undertake a journey of discernment if one arrives at the recognition that, in their particular case, there are limitations that diminish responsibility and culpability, particularly to the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist. Okay, what does that mean, Robert Royal?
Well, I wish I knew, Raymond. I mean, you know, in one way, we finally do, I think, have an explicit statement on the part of the Holy Father that there are, maybe very few, but there are some cases where people are divorced and remarried, involved in active sexual lives, what used to be called living in an adulterous relationship, that they can receive communion. Now, after, as you rightly say, after 2 years of meetings and after a document that was not very clear, there seems to be this move on the part of the Pope, although the letter that was sent to them wasn't made public, and then it was leaked, and then
the Vatican
then the Vatican
it.
eventually confirmed it. So it's, I've said about this, it's a very bizarre circumstance that we're in, that on a very sensitive point, we got the document Amoris Laetitia that was not clear in spite of some ambiguous footnotes, and now we do have a kind of a clear statement, but not a publicly issued clear statement.
I'm going to put that statement up. This is a little excerpt from the Pope's letter, and then, Father Jerry, I want you to respond to this. The Pope writes, in reacting to the teaching of the Buenos Aires bishops, the document is very good and completely explains the meaning of chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia. There are no other interpretations. Father Jerry Murray, what does that mean? Does that settle it?
It means that what the Pope said in the footnote 353 in chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, it means precisely what was said then, and is now the Pope has made it absolutely clear that in his opinion, in his way of looking at things, there are circumstances that people might find themselves in which they can continue to live in an adulterous relationship and at the same time receive communion. Now, the reason he says that is that they have diminished culpability for their adulterous behavior. And frankly, I'm not convinced by that argument at all. And there are many theologians and canonists, bishops who have said that this is not satisfactory because, as I think is now much clearer, this is a direct contradiction of what St. John Paul II said in Familiaris Consortio. So we are basically at a loggerheads here. One pope says you have to live continence if you're in an invalid marriage, if you want to receive the sacraments. And now Pope Francis is saying in some circumstances that's not necessary. This is a very unsatisfactory situation to be in.
Robert Royal, the door seems to be open wide here. There's a lot of talk of discernment, of accompaniment. But that, at least to my eye, puts all the onus on the local priest, the priest in the parish. He's really having to make this call. He is now, I guess, the local pope.
Well, there's some very intelligent and balanced people like Edward Peters and Father Joseph Fessio have been saying that this letter maybe can be read in an Orthodox way. And I think it's worth saying that the cases that are indicated here, at least for now, are few and very, very specialized kind of cases. But as we know, and the secular press is already saying this, the Pope has softened his stance about divorced and remarried Catholics receiving communion. And I think the danger here, if you read it very strictly, I agree with Father Murray, I'm not convinced by that argument, but if you read it very strictly, it is a very small number of people. But as we know, in modern America and in the modern world more generally, everybody thinks he's a special case. And everyone thinks there's a hard case and that there's a rationale for why they should be given an exemption. So I think that this is going to lead to a lot of mischief. And just before we came on the air, I saw a story that the bishops in Western Canada have already had to make a public statement saying there's been no change in the teaching about communion for the divorced and remarried. So we're going to see, in spite of the attempt to be very cautious about what's being affirmed here, I think we're going to see this is going to have cascading consequences.
Father Jerry, I want to throw this at you. Our friend Robert Royal wrote at the end of a column that's up at thecatholicthing.org that made international headlines, I should say. At the end of it, he says, indeed, Catholics have a new teaching now, not only on divorce and remarriage, we have a new vision of the Eucharist. What is the implication here? Do we really have a new vision of the Eucharist? Is it that broad?
Well, some people might have a new vision, but I think it's a faulty vision. In order to receive Holy Communion worthily, you have to be in the state of grace. And if you are living in public contradiction to the law of God, Jesus said, what God has joined, man must not divide. So if you're living in an adulterous second marriage and you approach Holy Communion at Mass, this is a contradiction of what God expects of you. Mitigating circumstances do not give you a get out of jail free card. Mitigating circumstances about culpability for sin, those apply in retrospect. You look back when you're making your examination for confession. What did I do? Was anything involved? If you're planning on committing adultery tomorrow and the day after, you can't claim mitigating circumstances. You have to say the call to conversion applies to me just as it applies to everyone else. So, yeah, the Eucharist, of course, is the greatest treasure that Christ gave the Church. It must be safeguarded. And we cannot say that adultery is not a mortal sin or it's not a public offense against the God's order. It is.
Robert Royal, you ended your piece with a very stark line. You say, I say this in sorrow, but I'm afraid that the rest of this papacy is now going to be rent by bands of dissenters, charges of papal heresy, threats of, and perhaps outright schism. Lord have mercy. What do you mean by that?
Well, I was one of these people who all along have said, and I was at both of the synods, Father was there with me at this last one, I've said all along that we shouldn't close the door until we're sure exactly what the Pope means. That until we have an explicit statement from him, we should presume that he's still in continuity. And clearly what he's trying to do is extend mercy, whether you believe that it's a good idea what he's trying to do.
And you believe this personal letter written to these bishops constitutes an explicit statement?
I think an explicit statement of some exceptions that will allow some people who are divorced and remarried and living an active sexual life to receive communion. And I can't help but think, I mean, we're already seeing it, and it's likely to only grow worse, that now that this has been stated explicitly, people who feel that there's some, there's some change, and I mentioned communion right before that because I think that ultimately, even it goes beyond the question of divorced and remarried, it's the sacrament of unity. Can we say on the basis of this that for perhaps a gay couple who are committed to one another and are faithful to one another and have always had same-sex attraction through no fault of their own, are there mitigating circumstances here? So there doesn't seem to me to be limiting factors here, and I think lots of people are going to be very agitated about the fact that these exceptions, which are likely to, I think, over time to grow larger and larger, that these exceptions now have been put on the agenda of the Church.
Father Gerald Murray, I've been getting a lot of emails, as you can imagine, about this. Some say the Pope is entitled to his opinion, but the teaching can't change. You as a canon lawyer and as a priest would say what?
Well, I would say the Pope has given a permission. He's not given a commandment. So as a priest, I don't have to follow this and say, if someone comes up to me and says, I'm living in an adulterous second marriage, I'd like to receive communion. And I'll say, no, unless you live as brother and sister, unless you split up, then you can return to the sacraments. So it is a permission. The teaching on adultery cannot change. The application in church law, which is what we call the discipline of the sacraments, that is what is attempting to be changed here. And in fact, I think it's quite clear that the Pope has given a change. But that, in my opinion, is going to be a matter that will disappear in the future because it's not grounded in the purpose of law is to defend the integrity of the sacramental system. I think this does the opposite, and it causes problems. The Polish bishops agree with me. A lot of people are very dissatisfied with this.
These bishops of Buenos Aires, they also did say it might be convenient that an eventual access to the sacraments be brought about in a reserved way. And they insist upon this because they want to be welcoming, and in their own words, without creating confusion regarding the teaching of the Church on the indissolubility of marriage. What does it mean to offer sacraments in a reserved way, Robert Royal, quickly before we run out of time?
Well, see, this is the ambiguity that I think has been with us ever since Cardinal Walter Casper was invited in February of 2014 to address the bishops. We've had now 2.5 years of what is allegedly, some sort of nuanced, limited accompaniment, internal. I mean, all these phrases have been out there, but at the end of the day, as Cardinal Peter Erdo, who was the president of the Synod, said, it's a simple choice. Either you give people communion or you don't. And we now have, I think we have to say this very, very clearly. We have a change in a teaching that has never been considered the Catholic teaching in the Western Church throughout its 2,000-year history. So there's something new that's emerged here, and it's got to be looked at very cautiously.
Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray, thank you for being here. You can read all of Robert and Father Jerry's insightful commentary at thecatholicthing.org, and Robert Royal's book, A Deeper Vision, The Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century, is available at bookstores everywhere and online.